Welcome, everybody, to this awesome xTalks talk. VJ is actually going to introduce our speakers, but I'm Cheryl Barnes, the Program Manager for Digital Learning and Residential Education, trying to fill Molly Ruggles' shoes here. The main thing you need to know, two things, is that we are filming, and we do intend to make the video available publicly on the ODL website later, so if you don't want to be seen here publicly associating with this crowd, you need to sit in the back. Yeah, and the second thing is to sign in on the makeshift clipboard that's going around. Vijay Kumar, Associate Dean and Senior Strategic Advisor for Digital Learning, an all-around great guy.
All right. Good afternoon, folks. Thank you all for waiting also. Karen Wilcox, whom is on the line there. Is she in there? Karen, you're there? So Karen is there. That's a third member of this panel, illustrious panel, and she's in Singapore. So she's virtually here, as was till a minute ago Sanjay was virtually here. And there's Sanjay Sharma, who's been leading this body of very important work. He and Karen were co-chairs of this online educational policy initiative. Claudia Ure, who's not here, a colleague of ours, was helping staff that work. And Eric and I were part of the internal committee for that work. But before we start talking about the work, a little bit of context. 2013, and I was just looking at this and remembering it's already 2016. 2013, President Rife launched the Future of Higher Education Task Force at MIT to understand the systemic implications. There's Claudia. I just introduced you, made reference to. So when President Rife launched the task force, it was to understand the implications or to look at the future of teaching and learning in light of the increasing centrality of digital learning and online education, and to understand it systemically. And the task force, for those of you who may have seen the report that was published and still available on the web, had three significant pillars. One was to look at the impact or its influence on residential education, the transformative influence on residential education. Second was to understand the impact on global education, global writ large, which was to understand MIT's relationship to the world, the community, outside community, not just international education. And the third was actually to look at the business of education, the practice, and how it impacted all the facilities and services with respect to education. The Online Educational Policy Initiative was undertaken as a follow-up to the task force report and the task force work. And its intent was to consider the impact of digital learning, of online learning, much more broadly, even more systemically, to look at policy implications, policy, whether it be in terms of what kinds of courses, curricula, policy in terms of governance, policy in terms of organizational constructs of institutes. And so the group worked for the better part of a year and came out with this report that was published. And what you're going to hear today, and first of all, alongside with the policy group, and this is important, we also, Eric and I, were PIs of an initiative that the NSF supported, which was called the Learning Science Online Symposium, whose focus was on trying to understand how research in learning sciences was influencing the development of online education, the delivery of online education, and vice versa. What were we observing in this new world of digital learning that could influence the research agenda for learning? And the work of that also fed into the Online Educational Policy Group. The Online Educational Policy Initiative, as you'll hear from the description, had set of our faculty who are the internal committee members and external advisory. Eric and I were part of the group. The group, like I said, was chaired by Sanjay and Karen. And what we're going to do today, I'm going to ask Sanjay and Eric, and as and when Karen pipes in, to present a quick overview of the work, but particularly highlight the recommendations that came out of the group. And subsequently, what I hope will come out through questions and through discussion would be an understanding of what are the kinds of implications for MIT education, for MIT's organization, for our work over here, are the initiatives that have been launched that speak to the recommendations. And then there is another part. I see that we have Bill Bonvillian and Philip over there. What we had done was presented this work at various forums in DC, the National Academies, and there was some amount of discussion and feedback, and hopefully Eric and Sanjay and Karen will speak to some of the things that we heard when we were discussing this in forums in DC. Over to you, Sanjay.
Thanks very much, Vijay. I have to say I was on time by MIT time. I was here at the stroke of 3:04 and 30 seconds. But I apologize. I was running from the other end of campus. So this, first of all, I should say that this study was funded, at least in part, by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. We put in a grant proposal. They graciously agreed to fund it. And the study consisted of two groups. We have the MIT group, which included the three of us, and Karen Wilcox. I point to the sky because she's actually dialing in, as Vijay said, from New Zealand. And Claudia was a part of that. And I see a couple of folks who are on the MIT group. Sanjoy Mahajan is here. And then we had a very eminent external advisory group from schools around the country. As Vijay said, the genesis of this is when we concluded our task force on the future of education at MIT, there were a lot of requests about doing something similar for the United States. And Bill Bonvillian and Philip, who run the Washington, D.C. office of MIT, I think very wisely said, look, you should take this on. And Bill and Philip also played a really important part in this, because not only are they MIT's representatives in DC, they're also leading thinkers in this space. Philip played a very important role. In fact, we deputed him as well to be an author of the final report. So, how do we describe this? We, when we started this report, we thought, it's going to be about online education, it's going to be about policy. We'll just, take the future of education thing at MIT, put some, study policy, and we'll write something. But as we started studying this space, we began to get more and more introspective. What is learning really? What are we trying to achieve? Because we were looking at it from a different angle. If we weren't looking at it from a different angle, I suspect we would have produced something that looked familiar and perhaps similar to previous reports on policy and education. Because we were looking at it from a fundamentally different angle, which is online education, it's sort of interestingly, we got sucked into a intoxicating vortex. Are vortices intoxicating? Maybe they are. Anyway, it was an intoxicating vortex of research into academic work, not just in education, but also in other spaces. And we very rapidly came to the conclusion that, of course, you have to think about the learner. The learner is at the center of it. And then around the learner, you have the learning environment. And then you have the institutional context, right? The institutional context is this of course, this is higher ed. Is it a college? Is it a community college? Why is the learner in there? What are their motivations? Then you have the social context. Is this learner working a second job? Right? Is this learner supported by family? Are there loans? And there's the global context. Is this learner studying to go out and work outside the country? And then once you do that, then you begin to realize that there are all these other fields that get sucked into it. And again, if you don't think of it as if online education weren't one of the instigating aspects of this, we needn't have looked into all this. But once we got in, we started peeling the onion, we got pretty deep. And so what was supposed to be, frankly, Bill, a sort of a quick pro forma study turned into a maniacal vortex. It's a maniacal vortex of research. And we ended up reviewing something like 1,000 papers in different fields, and went to conferences and attended various events around the world. And Sanjoy would call me at 7 p.m. and said, hey, you need to read this paper. And, so Karen and I would speak, and, when she was traveling, and it turned to, and, Eric, poor guy, had to put up with a lot of this stuff. And he would say, no, you got to look at this. And so we found that there was research from obviously education research, but a lot of research in DBER, discipline-based education research, which is another way of saying, if you're going to understand how to teach biology, you got to understand biology, right? And how do you explain biology? And then educational technologies, all these amazing things happening in education technology, psychology, cognitive psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, economics. We had David Otter on the study, and he's done some amazing work on the ROI of education. And so we got into this, and then we came to sort of an interesting realization, which is if you look at the epistemological evolution of various fields, take biology, for example, or zoology. The way I studied biology was zoology and botany, which was you study things from the outside in. So a lot of these fields are outside in, which is you study from the outside, you observe a plant, you observe a leaf. But MIT has a unique history in a number of fields from taking outside in fields and turning them inside out. At MIT, when we teach biology, it's genetics, it's biochemistry, it's cell biology. In economics, when Paul Samuelson came to MIT, he started what is now the #1 department in the world in economics, which is much more sort of models, sort of inside out. Finance, same thing. And the inside out models start with sort of mechanistic explanations. They are more intrinsic in their explanations. They're more translatable sort of insights and so on. And so the insight was that as we got into the field that there is, leaving aside online, which is of course a very important part of this, a unique opportunity right now to perhaps make that jump in the space of education and to really think through what's inside out and what's outside in. Many of you have also had to tolerate rants, also called presentations from me, about some of the things we've learned in cognitive psychology. And I use that as an example here. How do you bridge those three fields? Cognitive psychology and education, I think it's well established. Cognitive psychology and neuroscience, we're not there yet. It's going to take 10, 15 years, maybe. But for some conditions like dyslexia, the connections are beginning to emerge. It's actually quite fascinating. But the same thing in other fields, economics, intrinsic motivation, grit, curiosity, just amazing stuff happening. And so that's how we got into this, that's how this report evolved. It took a lot longer than it was supposed to, but not because we were lazy, but which we're capable of, but because it took us into this new orbit. And the summary is we have 4 recommendations. I'm going to present number 1 and number 4, and I'm going to, and Eric is going to represent 2 and 3. Karen Wilcox was supposed to do this, so I can't do it in a New Zealand accent, so you're going to hear it in my accent. Recommendation 1 is that this is a real opportunity to create an interdisciplinary collaboration across fields of research in higher education, across the silos. A really wonderful opportunity. And it's no coincidence that MIT launched the MIT Integrated Learning Initiative in February. In fact, this report was supposed to be published in January, and then snow happened. So we ended up presenting it instead in April. We were acting on what the report said. And so we have mightily, John Gabrielli is going to be the director. We've already talked about it. I've shown you the slide. And the idea is to take all these diverse fields and pull them together. And maybe at this point, I'll hand over to Eric and pick up from there. Sure. I'll let you present this slide, Eric.
Can I just check, Karen, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is there a musical segue before I get to
No,
talk?
I'm sorry. You wait till that. That's only for me.
I'm dancing, Eric. You just can't see it.
All right. So as Sanjay was saying, there's just this is sort of getting a little bit more into some of the specifics of the fields that we draw upon, and fields and practices, actually, I'll say as well. As we think about designing learning environments, as we think about assessing learning environments and learning opportunities, we need to draw upon a lot of different traditions, a lot of different practices, and a lot of different theories, and a lot of different research to sort of make those effective. And in doing so, we need to think about the purposes of each of those different learning environments, because we may, as Sanjay talked about these layered contexts, we may need to design particular learning environments for particular goals and particular contexts, and we need to sort of draw upon other principles as we do some of those things. And so in a lot of cases, if you sort of point to any one of these, you might sort of think of it as like, people think that this is the sort of pedagogy, or this is the theory that's going to sort of drive things forward. And we know that that's not the case, that we sort of need to think about a mixture of all these practices, and it's all context dependent. So these are a few of the sort of more specific things under this idea of sort of working in this way. So we need to recognize, encourage, and reward interdisciplinary collaborations. So we can sort of say that we need to draw upon all these different traditions, but as an institute of higher education where we're sort of doing things and we're sort of thinking about things as a model, how do we actually sort of model those interdisciplinary collaborations? Where we think about both the science of it, how we want to do research around it, and how we implement these things as well. What are the ways that we can promote those collaborations? What are the ways that we think about departmental and interdepartmental work in centers? Mightily is, I think, a good first manifestation of what this can mean. Similarly, we need to create a welcoming environment for that interdisciplinary research and for collaborative efforts to translate that research into practice. So in a lot of cases, we have really interesting research, but we're not really able to sort of think about ways that actually becomes part of practice in a significant way. I think, again, that's part of what Mightily's mission is to both conduct some of that research, but also think about ways that we make that research accessible here on campus and more broadly. And that goes to bridging the gap between that research and practice. We need to think about what are the mechanisms by which we do that. Is it about publication? Is it about product dissemination? Is it about collaborations with other institutions that sort of bring different expertise into the mix? And that means about working together to ensure that those gains are real improvements for students. And those real improvements need to be things that we not only can measure, but things that we value. And that's really important things to think about how those go together. Because it's easy to do one or the other, but to think about things that we both value and that we can measure and sort of think about ways that we can improve on incrementally is an important mixture. And we need to move beyond these silos, and that it's an easy thing to say, but a harder thing to do to be able to really have interdisciplinary work. I think we at MIT are good models of this in other disciplines that we've done through a lot of the centers here, but I think we can do more in this space. So the next recommendation is to promote online as an important facilitator in higher education. We think of digital technologies that can play a significant role as an education enabler by providing a dynamic digital scaffold. As we think about this, we think about online not only as an exclusive environment for learning, but as part of a learning experience. So to do that, we need to be able to design for the unique affordances of online learning. We need to take advantage of what we can do online. So that means not only a lot of the initial efforts that we've done, and I don't mean just at MIT, but we sort of think about things that we did sort of face-to-face and things that we just sort of move those things online. And over time, we start to realize that online actually has its own set of unique affordances that we need to be able to take advantage of. At the same time, we realize that there's a lot of things that happen face-to-face personally that we need to be able to take advantage of as well. And creating those hybrid environments that ultimately take advantage of both those things is clearly the way that I think most people think that this field is headed. And in doing so, what we need to think about is some of the ways that the online environment, in fact, with its digital trails, ultimately gives us data that helps us iteratively improve on both those learning experiences. And we need to do that in sort of designed and thoughtful ways. So, a lot of our initial efforts, again, sort of broadly thinking is we can collect everything, we can sort of analyze that, and ultimately that will help us improve. But really what we need to be thinking about is, are there specific experiments, specific interventions that we can do, specific kinds of data that we're interested in that we think is valuable, and how can we collect those data trails and ultimately use that as the tool for helping us improve? We need to, I mentioned this interplay between sort of face-to-face and online, and we need to think about how teachers play a role in that learning context. And by teachers, I mean this broadly as we may be thinking about traditional faculty, but as we think about the ways that online learning may help promote more field-based experiences, and we need to think about how those people play a role in the education of our students as well. And that in turn allows us opportunities for creating other kinds of innovative learning experiences beyond the course. And that's a part of our dialogue on campus at this point in time, is the way that we sort of use modular experiences to be part of learning. But that means that we might be able to think about more project-based learning. We think about ways that students are doing internships and externships, and how that can become part of their learning experience, combined with just-in-time learning that we may be able to provide them online from campus. Situating learning in their field, again, that could be practicums, it could be classes based on field experiences, it could be internships. And one this one's deeply important to me is combining knowledge of learning optimization with deep learning. As I mentioned earlier, there's a certain set of things that we can think about, that we can teach and learn, that we can easily measure, and we can think about optimizing those things. But we also need to think about what are the sort of deep learning that we need to have students mastering as they come to our campus, and what are the things that we want them to leave with. And those things may not be the same things. When we can think about, again, interdisciplinary research, how do we combine those things that we're actually really providing students with the most valuable learning experience they can have in the number of years that they're here. And finally, we need to think about ways that this happens at scale. And I think that goes to both our on-campus experiences and off-campus. So off-campus, I think, is easier to think about what we mean by scale. How do we sort of take the ideas here that we're doing at MIT and allow others to access those. But I think it also happens that is relevant to here on campus as well. If we think about things like project-based learning and some of those field experiences, we say, well, that's great. We might be able to get 20 or 30 students involved in those. But if we want all of our, over 4,000 undergraduates to be involved in that, how do we actually scale those learning experiences so that it touches each one of those undergraduates and graduate students for that matter? We need to accelerate the adoption of science-based learning practices. So again, this gets to this idea of a lot of things that sort of get bottled up in the academic institutions that we need to be able to disseminate and move forward. And that's about identifying those paths forward to a more equitable and more available system. So that's where MIT plays a role in a sort of global system. So it is something that I think impacts our campus because we are part of a global system. And I think that's become part of our mission to sort of be able to impact those outside of MIT as well as those inside of MIT. And that is a two-way street where I think that we all realize that the value that comes to campus from having some of those global interactions. So with that, I will let you
Thank you, yeah.
define the learning engineer.
Thank you. So we struggled a little bit with this, but if you look at the way learning, the design of learning experiences has gone, I'm going to use a term that some people like and some don't. If you go to Disneyland, which I had the pleasure of going to twice within a 3-month period a few years ago, and so the second time turned purely sort of a scholarly exercise for me to make sure I didn't go mad. What I noticed was how beautifully the experience is designed to engage and absorb, money. The 13-year-old victim to which I was attached. And it's extraordinary. I mean, it's an experience. So really, if we think of every encounter where a student is immersed in learning, where they're investing time as an opportunity to make an impact, we should be thinking of how to engineer that opportunity to have maximum value to them in terms of not just how well they learn, but how we speak to their motivation, their interest, the ways in which they'll use it, and creating an experience that involves technology, as Eric just said, the classroom, the lab, the hands-on, perhaps even the experience that they take to work, maybe when they go into an internship. And so we were trying to figure out what to call it. In the end, we ended up using a term that Herbert Simon, the Nobel laureate, came up with. We came up with it independently, and we were like, maybe we shouldn't use this. But since he came up with it, okay, we should just use it. So the term is a learning engineer. And what we also have found is at MIT, we have this extraordinary tradition of folks within disciplines becoming passionate about learning. We have, of course, at MIT, we have the digital learning labs, formerly called the MIT X Fellows. These are folks who really lead change in learning strategies within departments. Even Deepa, I saw Deepa somewhere. Where's she? There's Deepa. She's she comes from the field. She's an expert in an academic area, and she's under the tutelage of people like Laurie, and working with others like her, she's become an expert on learning. And so the idea of a learning engineer is sort of an insider in the field adopting change and then bringing that change to students and creating a new experience. So just like a Disney engineer, the term we proposed was a learning engineer. And it is not without controversy, but so be it, because we want to make a point. And so that was the third recommendation. Now remember, these are not recommendations for MIT. These are recommendations to higher education. That we need to start thinking of every learning encounter as an opportunity that we need to cherish and maximize, not sort of a dismissive thing where you deliver what you need to deliver and leave. And the final recommendation is that talk is cheap, but we've got to foster institutional change. And one of the sort of the driving forces here is the extraordinary change that is happening around us. There is a company in New York called General Assembly. If you want to learn web development, I don't think you should come to MIT. General Assembly, 6 months, they guarantee you a job. You're going to learn web dev better than if you come to MIT. Presumably, MIT prepares you for life. And so we better take that seriously. And if MIT prepares you for life, then every other university also is trying to prepare you for life. And so there needs to be an agenda of change, which involves role models, which involves change agents, which involves communities of practice. And so what we recommended in this task force, and this really is directed towards legislators and funding agencies and the White House, is, folks, you need to create centers of excellence that radiate change that other institutions can adopt, because that's the only way change happens. If you look at, this is something I've done a little bit of research on in the past, if you look at things like smoking cessation, which is a terrible thing, it's smoking. America has made a lot of progress because there was a concerted action to create change, and it happened. If we can do it to something like that, then surely the higher institutions of higher ed, which are about change and learning, should learn to change. And we need to have an agenda in this country for following an improvement, a movement towards improving learning. That was the fourth recommendation. Again, these are not recommendations to MIT, but it would not be MIT-like if we made these recommendations to the world and we didn't believe them. And so the good news is we truly believe them, which is why we've launched the initiatives we have over the last year or so. Thanks very much. And I think after this we have some Q&A and discussion and so on.
Sure. Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you. It's wonderful. And thank you, Karen. I'm going to ask, Karen, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Yes. Did you want to add any comments to what Sanjay and Eric have described?
No, I think they did a great job covering everything.
So not great. But not to put you on the spot, but I will in any case, because there was a term, and I've heard you speak to it before, and before we ask the audience of questions, the term digital scaffolding was used, and could you speak a little to what might be examples of digital scaffolding? Particularly, I mean, we know that things like mightily represent organizational implementations of some of the recommendations. Are there initiatives, projects that speak to recommendations like the digital scaffolding?
Sure. So I guess one concrete example of digital scaffold is a project that we're working on with the Department of Education that Vijay and I are co-leading. And that's a project that's developing a fly-by-wire system for education. So a fly-by-wire system is a really great example of a digital scaffold in another setting, and that setting is in the piloting of modern aircraft, where a fly-by-wire system is the digital automated system that takes readings from sensors that are all over the aircraft, particularly on the wings, and closes in an automated way a feedback loop to make low-level adjustments while a human pilot, is still flying the plane. So it's a really great example of how technology and humans work together to achieve performance and safety and robustness in a system that a human pilot could never hope to do alone. So we're drawing on inspiration from that idea to sort of ask the question whether in education one could think of using digital technologies in a similar way, where there's some element of the process that's automated in the sense that there is sensing. One could imagine asking questions, assessments of students, sensing what's going on, and then making decisions using logic to close the loop and to provide instantaneous feedback, but doing it in such a way that it's actually complementing what a human instructor or human pilot is doing at the same time. And I think that's just one example. In fact, if we look across engineering, we would find many examples where digital technology has revolutionized the way products and processes are done, that we could draw a lot of inspiration. And I think a common theme throughout all those examples is feedback. And that's something we know as educators, that feedback is so critical, and that timely feedback is really critical. And that's something that without digital technology, we really struggle to do well. So I think that's one really concrete example of a digital scaffold.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you. So now,
Can I give
sure.
I just want to pick up on what Karen said. In this room is someone called Blake Elias, who's right there, just finished his master's thesis on
Blake, show yourself.
Blake, easily embarrassed. But Blake is an undergrad at MIT, just finishing his bachelor's thesis. Has written a program called Homer, which is a spaced learning flashcard system. And the most important thing in that is trying to sense when you're forgetting something, because it turns out that's the most important time to remind you. It's actually no point, learning is much more powerful if you're told something when you're about to forget it, strangely enough. So it means you need to detect forgetting. So that's another example of a sensor that detects and a scaffolding that reacts. Sorry.
You know, if forgetting is key, I'd make a great learner. So, now it's over to you folks, really. Yes.
This is Paul.
I need you to use the mic. Sorry.
Thank you. This has been really terrific. You've assembled, Sanjay and Vijay and Eric, a really powerful team to understand a lot about learning and how we learn. And as you know, I'm very interested in what trickles down from this to K-12 education. And so my question really is, what have we learned about change? What have we learned about how schools and institutions can change in the best ways? And in the early stages of what you're proposing and these 4 recommendations, how can we best prepare schools and ourselves for the kinds of change that you're talking about?
It's a great question, and it's a really hard one. So the mic was passed to me. I think what we've learned in the K-12 space about educational change. I mean, we see, and it's a bit of a different system because the most of higher education is sort of a much more decentralized system, whereas most of K-12 education is a much more centralized system. And I think there's pros and cons to those two things. I think one thing that we've seen in the K-12 space with the rise of the charter movement, which is very controversial, and we see those controversies persisting to today, is that some of the schools that are sort of innovation leaders have ultimately become examples and have driven a lot of change outside of their own organizations, even if it's not just sort of directly reflecting their practices. It has sort of instigated and motivated change a lot of other places. And I think that we hopefully can see the same sort of propagation in the higher education space as well, where even though we may be only one institution, and many people may see, like they see the charter schools as exceptional, that we can sort of model change for a lot of other places as well. But that said, that propagation is still quite slow, and it's something that we haven't seen, I think, make nearly the kinds of progress we'd like to at the pre-college level. I do think in those cases the centralization has inhibited some of that progress, and it's something that I think the much more decentralized system we have in higher education has the potential to move faster without quite so much regulation and top-down organization with that.
Maybe I'll just add to Eric's really great comments. Woody Flowers always talked about the difference between training and education, and what's happened with online is kids more and more, as you know, do Khan Academy. So that's one vector where kids show up, and that schools are forced to sort of flip their classroom. So that's one vector for change. The second is schools like High Tech High, et cetera, which are, exemplars. And the third, of course, is the charter school movement. But actually, I think you would agree with this, Eric. I think there's a great appetite for change from the foundations, the Gates Foundation, Broad Foundation. So change may not be easy, but in K-12, this report is not about K-12, but this is as good a time as any, and which is why we've launched our PK-12 initiative.
I'll add one more thing in terms of that hunger for change, and I think in the pre-college space, the hunger for change is definitely in the common people. I think people would like to see, they feel like it's not meeting the needs of a lot of the kids today, and I think that we're starting to see the same thing in higher education, that people feel like the kinds of learning that they're getting, the kind of learning experiences they're getting in a lot of higher education institutions are not meeting the needs that they have in this day and age, and so that will in turn sort of force change in a lot of places.
I believe one of the opportunities we might have is to use enlightened self-interest to make sure that we influence K-12 in a way that it serves us well. So wouldn't it be wonderful if we understood the science of learning and digital tools enough that we absolutely nailed one of the commodity learning problems in K-12 and put out the set of tools that people could use, and if we made a difference, I believe the economy would drive, teachers that are out there doing nothing other than conveying codified information and calling it education would not have much to do, because kids would take the other route, train themselves, and then seek sources of real education. So I think we can cause change by creating an exemplar.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And we should get Woody and Angie together. And so, Angie Belcher heads up our PK-12 initiative. Eric is a very key player in that. We should have you and Angie and Eric meet and talk about that.
And we've had a lot of discussion around just that kind of thing. What are the best ways that we can sort of, whether it's exemplars or curricula or tools, what are the best ways that we can sort of make things that in themselves are meaningful and become ultimately items that sort of propagate additional change and replication. We don't have to make it all.
Hi guys. You mentioned outside in, inside out, and you have constructivism, active learning, project problem, all this stuff. Very many different contexts that an individual would be in. Was there some common threads that you saw in them that we could see from the individual looking out?
Absolutely. It's a great question. So the thing is that we have all these observational terms. Active learning works, flipped classroom works, constructivism, right? The good news from the inside out is there is, in fact, a common thread, which was actually discovered by a colleague at MIT, which is curiosity. It turns out that curiosity is the equivalent of hunger. You can actually see curiosity within EEG. They actually didn't know it was curiosity. They saw a pattern in the EEG, and they found that students learn better, which by itself was useless. And then there was a German group that said, oh, that pattern occurs when people are curious. And so now we've discovered that curiosity is that thing, which also ties to something actually Lotus has been talking a lot about, which is perseverance and grit. So there are actually common threads that are emerging. But if you look at it from the outside in, they just seem like these different things that are just words. But the inside-out view gives you a sort of a common basis to connect some of this thinking. We don't have it all connected, for sure, but patterns are emerging, and they're fascinating.
This report comes out at a time when I think everybody would agree that public higher education is under incredible stress. And I'm thinking in particular at a budget level. You read every day. I mean, even places like Berkeley are just in such distress. And the report seems to have skated away from the third rail of online as a cost efficiency measure, which several years ago we heard a lot about. I think President Reif even talked about that in his inaugural speech when he talked about MITx. He mentioned, reducing the cost of education. What conversations did you have about that, and how did you avoid that?
So, thank you for raising that. No, no, we actually had a lot of conversations about it. But I think the conversations become very black and white, and that's part of the problem. The problem is there's a numerator and there's a denominator, right? The numerator is how much you learn, and the denominator is how much it costs. And if you point at the cost, it becomes a very negative conversation. It becomes sort of a, anyone from the finance world here, any CFO type? No, it becomes a bean counter conversation. And that doesn't necessarily end in a good place. So instead, what we did here, and one of the reasons we ended up going the other way, was to look at both the ups. How do you make learning more effective? Let's say, just as engineers and as scientists, as MIT types, let's say you could make learning twice as effective. Presumably, and obviously this is not true, you could educate in half as much time, right? If that worked. Obviously that isn't how it works. But philosophically, the idea is how do you make sure that the system results in better learning? And what are the modalities that result in better learning? If we can't answer that question, we felt that the discussion becomes a very negative, potentially, and a polarizing one. And that's why we went deep.
Okay. Let me offer an insight from, so Vijay mentioned that he and I led another NSF sponsored workshop on learning sciences and online learning. And it was, again, a multidisciplinary sort of set of people from discipline-based education and online learning and other sorts of fields that came in. And we did a design activity as part of that, which was envisioning actually did a dual one, what a dystopian future of education, higher education would look like and what a utopian future might look like. I think it was like 10 or 15 years down the road. And I'll say that at least in the utopian worlds, none of them involved a lack of people involved in the education of our students. It was playing different roles. There were lots of words of like mentoring and guidance and field-based education. So it was still things that involved a lot of people, and those people still cost resources to do. So I think a lot of it is really thinking about ways that we can better use our resources and make it goes back to the effectiveness of it and making for more effective learning experiences rather than just ways that we can simply get people through at the highest throughput.
Okay, so you talked about bridging research and practice, making sure that the research that gets done both here and elsewhere gets actually implemented. And I'm curious how you see that actually happening. Like, what would you imagine happens to take research that comes from the lab, things that are happening recently, even things that are going back to the 1880s, Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve that we still haven't really capitalized on? How would you make sure that that gets implemented?
I think this is, it's a good question because it's easy for us to sort of talk the big talk and do nothing. But the good news is that we do have the edX platform, right? And so the good news is if we can actually mobilize. You have edX, we have Scratch, you have App Inventor, we have OpenCourseWare, we have all these unbelievable projection mechanisms for projecting education. And we're doing amazing stuff residentially thanks to our DLL colleagues, the folks from the teaching learning labs, et cetera. So we can actually work them into the system because there is a stream of innovation potentially that we can work it into. The details, we still have to work out. So for example, that's why your Homer, right? How do we get it in? Where do we try it? How do we, if not Homer, some other idea, how do we get it in? This is something that we are having conversations with our colleagues, the DLLs, with our engineering group. MITx has its own engineering group to put stuff into the system. For example, Chuang's led an amazing amount of work on item response theory, which is trying to calibrate the difficulty of a assessment, right? So we have a unique opportunity. If we don't succeed, and if we don't do a good job, then shame on us. But the opportunity is there.
I'm gonna take it up a level from there, and I don't know whether you purposely avoided this or not. But there's been an institutional commitment to doing all the things that Sanjay just said. So there's been an institutional commitment to making edX. There's been institutional commitments at various levels to Scratch and to App Inventor and to other sorts of products. And that means in the case of some of those things, it means actual resources. In other cases, it means sort of recognizing the valued contributions of faculty and staff who are doing things that are not only sort of research tools, but things that actually get out into the world and make a difference. And I think that's a whole sort of cultural perspective that we have here at this institution where we value in terms of the academic contributions things that actually get out into the world and make a difference. And I think that's another thing that we need to be able to sort of convey and purvey to other institutions is that value in everything from promotion and tenure to the ways that resources get distributed.
The question I have is about the organizational change, and it's kind of, I just wonder if you could comment on this, the idea that education has always sort of happened in a ecosystem of quality information, and the minute we take education online, it's sort of like a whole different ballgame in terms of there's a lot of things behind paywalls, and it's really difficult to share information a lot of times in the digital realm. And so part of what I think of in terms of organizational change is, can we change that playing field? Can we change that landscape? And when I say that, I think you probably know I'm from the library. And so what information literacy means to me is when students leave MIT, they're going to go out there and they're going to work in that way. That's what information literacy would be. They're going to help influence the way information is disseminated and shared.
Look, MIT is the home of open source software. MIT is the home of open education resources. CEAS is sitting somewhere there. What OpenCourseWare has done for the world, 200 million people. Joe Pickett behind you, a lot of OpenCourseWare folks here. It is historic, okay, on the one hand. On the other hand, if you take what we've done with edX, we've given the content as freemium, right? I mean, anyone can take it. And edX itself, the software is open source. Why did we do this? To go beyond the paywall, right? There are many companies willing to put up, erect barriers and charge, and we said, no, that's not us. So we have, we've taken the right steps, I think, to enable change. We're giving it away for free. I mean, how much more can you do, right? I think MIT, it's sort of like it's our responsibility almost. It sounds condescending, but which other institution is going to do it? It is our responsibility to do what Woody just said, which is to take on the challenge and address it. We announced a campaign, become 4 challenges. One of them is education, right? And then if we can take care of every disease in the world and climate change, I think we're golden.
A lot of anticipation with the pass. So I sort of have a dreamer question here.
What a questionable dream, one of the two.
Yeah, it could be either. I'm looking around at institutions and seeing how teaching and learning labs are springing up with particular focuses or even maybe evolving into having broader focuses. There's existing teaching and learning, there's existing research groups. I'm curious through your research if you looked out across universities and said, they're doing it really well. And if so, I'm wondering if you could sort of piece together, a university of the future that had the best teaching and learning labs or ODL, whatever you want to call them, labs, groups, research, where they would be located now and how you would put them together into an organization. How do they work together to fulfill your recommendations?
So I do some research on innovation. I'm going to make a quick comment. I think I think that innovation is a state of mind. We think of teaching and learning research as someone else does, and tell us what we need to do and we'll do it. But so one of the conclusions of this report is you got to break down the silos, and there's got to be a little TLL in every one of our heads. Okay, we've got to be sort of passionate. It can't be a vocation. It is a high intellectual pursuit. If I'm teaching angular momentum, to figure out the best way to explain angular momentum is something I should aspire to, not something I say, you figure it out and tell me, right? It's great if you have an idea, I want to learn it. So in some ways, many of the efforts have been, I think, saved by the TLLs. The TLLs are fantastic, really amazing what they've done. They've been, but I think the next generation is to have our teaching and learning labs, digital learning labs, et cetera, but for every academic to take this as a high intellectual pursuit and not as an afterthought. That's my view on it. I don't know if you want to add to that.
That's good.
One last question, comment over there, and then
It's kind of fun to have like enlightened people that get this, but the way organizations work, there's a bureaucracy that forms on an organization, and it optimizes what that current mission or whatever for that organization is, and defends it against outside changing. To have a good organization, you want a good, efficient bureaucracy. I'm not saying that they're bad, but they kind of get crusty. And we've got many of these all around. You have the K-12, the school committee.
Are you pointing at Eric?
Him, yeah. So with these different groups, I tend to be a joyful person that has to work inside many of them. And you mentioned that you're going to have a different set of people that are different, like people in the field that are helping to educate. You're going to have, the trouble is you're going to have different organizations that have got to pay people that would have this responsibility to do both kind of their job in this situation, but also be the liaison or whatever with the schools, for example. That's a tough cookie to crack, to get bureaucracies. Just MIT's insurance policy. Do we allow middle school kids on campus in certain situations? Or there's all sorts of bureaucratic things that really prevent the innovation from happening. And how do you pay someone where it's not in my job description to do this kind of stuff? How do you get that from above to say, oh, it's valued to actually have someone like me help out with the CEPT program or something like that? How do you crack that bureaucratic crust?
Well, I mean, two or three things, and just in the interest of time. One is change begins at the top, and the reason I was late was I was in the president's office, and he's so excited about it, he made me late. You can send him an email, by the way. Okay. So change begins at the top. That's number one. And number two, I think the most sort of irrepressible energy at MIT is the intellectual one. You just can't stop it. That's why, answer to the gentleman's question, I feel that if we all take it seriously, I think the MIT bureaucracy recognizes when there's that sort of the glint, the crazy glint in someone's eyes. We figure out a way to make it happen. So I'm hoping that glint is in a lot of people's eyes. And actually it is. We've just, I think, officially recognized it as a legal glint.
I'll just add the one last thing, which is, as I think everybody knows here, that so one of our mottos, our unofficial mottos, is it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. I mean, that's not the motto of every institution. In fact, it's not the motto of most institutes of higher education. And so I think that does sort of provide a slightly more flexible model for sort of some grassroots. So in addition to the top-down, some grassroots efforts to sort of promote some of that change that then becomes recognized at the top.
So I wanted to, first of all, thank you all for all the questions before I thank the panelists. Some quick comments. One, when Sanjay, Eric, Karen, and myself, along with Bill and Philip, we went around to various agencies in DC to talk about the report. We were struck by the enthusiasm and the interest in this report and the fact that MIT was actually naming the issue and doing something about it. And there is some issues like the ones that you have raised, for instance, organizational change and how do you deal with this? And there were roles that have been pointed out about learning engineers. What does this beast look like? Where do you place them organizationally? And all these questions, which are good problems of real implementation, real change, and some of the questions you've raised. So, but I was struck by the fact that there was interest that MIT was doing it, and that MIT was actually demonstrating by example. So the launch of Mightily, or talking about learning engineers in the context of our work. And then also the fact that every time, and this was in the discussion when Karen described her fly-by-wire project over there, or when we talked about every MITx course representing an opportunity to bring what we have learned about the learning of science or from learning sciences in the redesign of that course. That we're actually walking the talk, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in large ways. So that's very important because it goes back, I think, to what Woody was saying, was to really what we were doing and what we can be doing is show compelling value for this kind of thing that draws upon learning sciences, the sciences. Your slide, which referred to showing optimization with learning effectiveness, to see how we can balance these seemingly competing forces. So the extent to which we can demonstrate value through our initiatives, we begin to influence change. And we see this happening. People are coming from other institutions, from other countries, who say, partner with us to show us how it could be done. And so that's the thing. So I want to thank Sanjay, I want to thank Eric, I want to thank Karen in New Zealand or Singapore, somewhere out there. And thank you all for your very insightful questions and comments.